Please continue.
Okay, excellent. So I'm going to share my screen. I just gave a brief introduction to where we're headed tonight, and you can see that on my screen momentarily. There we go. Actually, this is part 3. Sorry, not part 2. Part 3, Maimonides is a philosophical visionary. And as you can see here, these are our 3 focal points for tonight. His philosophy of Judaism, and Judaism as a philosophy. And although they look similar, it's not just a play on words. I'm thinking of this more, the first one, in terms of how he constructs a sense of an overarching vision of Judaism. And we'll see unique ways in which he does this, as opposed to a specific approach to interpreting Judaism philosophically, which will be the bulk of our learning tonight. Okay, the second part will be the real focal point for this evening, and then the last one will be a kind of a jump off to our 4th session, which is a kind of a segue between tonight's and our last one. That connects to Jewish and Gentile wisdom, because our fourth session is on ethics, and our last source is taken from one of his ethical works. So without further ado, I'm going to try to do what as we've done before, and stop at different points to try to take some questions along the way, because it's a little bit awkward here. I can't see you if to pause to take a question or to clarify. So I'm going to try to stop on my own at different points, so that you can raise some questions or we have some reactions. Okay, so the first point here that I want to explore with you is this issue of Maimonides' philosophy of Judaism. And here I want to focus on his introductions. Maimonides cultivated the art of the introduction at a time when they were really getting underway in the Jewish world. He was not the innovator of the introduction. This was in the Jewish community. This was the first one to do this was actually Saadia Gaon back in the 9th and 10th centuries. But Saadia Gaon actually himself got it from the Muslim environment, which had started to develop introductions not long before that period, around the 9th century, late 8th, early 9th century. And they actually got it through translations of Greek works from some of the classic Greek commentaries from Alexandria, the city of Alexandria, Egypt, which produced a great deal of philosophical commentaries on Aristotle in antiquity. And in particular, in the 5th and 6th centuries, we see a genre developing of introduction literature. And when these works were translated into Arabic, the genre of introductions was introduced along with it. And the Jewish culture that thrived in the Islamic world during this period, as it immersed itself in the Arabic literature, it adopted many of its literary forms. And Maimonides became took the introduction to a certain art form. And in all of his major works, he has introductions. And it's really interesting to think about the role that they play. And here I want to focus on how they serve to structure his vision of Judaism in various capacities. And certain key introductions here are crucial to understanding how his philosophy of Judaism unfolds. So first of all, we can see this already in his earliest halachic work, the commentary to the Mishnah. Here he has no less than 3 introductions. All right. The first one, as you can see here, is the introduction to the Mishnah as a whole. Okay, the introduction to the whole Mishnah, and it's really a masterpiece. And here is the first time Maimonides lays out his philosophy of Judaism. He describes the relationship between the written Torah and the oral Torah. He talks about the development of tradition. He describes the difference between the legal parts of the tradition and the agadic parts of the tradition. He talks about the nature of the way in which both the prophets and the sages develop their ideas or present their ideas in both exoteric and esoteric ways. He talks about the relationship between prophecy and learning and scholarship, and then by the end he kind of has this extraordinary discussion of the purpose of humanity and the purpose of the human being in the order of the world. It's really kind of a tremendous kind of tour de force of his both philosophy of Judaism and the Jewish tradition, and how it sort of syncs with his conception of the ideal life for a human being. So this is the first time that he tries to do this, and he does it extraordinarily well and sets the tone for later works. However, he also has two smaller introductions within his commentary on the Mishnah. And they're known as, the one is the introduction to Perek Chelek. This is, at the time Maimonides was writing, it was the beginning of the introduction to the 10th chapter of Sanhedrin. In our day, it's the 11th chapter, just the way that the chapters are differently divided over the generations. But this became a very important occasion for Maimonides to develop his philosophy of the fundamental principles of the Jewish tradition, the big ideas that all Jews should adhere to if they consider themselves to be full-fledged members of the Jewish community. So it's, in other words, according to this is a really, really important point that Maimonides wanted to make, that Judaism is a lot more than a series of actions or rituals. That Judaism is that a Torah life also really centers around or sort of pivots around key fundamental concepts and ideas that really defines what it means to be a Jew. And in that respect, he kind of devotes I'm sorry, David, would you mind just muting everybody except for me, if possible?
I'll do my best. If I end up muting you, Elisha, please, please unmute yourself.
Okay, hold on a second. Let me get out of the share so I can see. All right.
Okay, and you know what? Let me also, while we're at it, let me make you a co-host as well to give you more powers.
Okay.
And I'm going to unmute everybody, and again, you might have to unmute yourself. So just one second. Sorry, right now I'm not seeing all the participants. I apologize.
Well, let me see if I can do it on my end.
Oh, you're right. I have it.
Yeah, I got it. Never mind. I can do it. Okay, good. So wonderful. Everybody can still hear me. So I'm going to go back to my screen. Terrific. Okay. Good. So this is the place where Maimonides introduces his 13 principles of what's known as the 13 principles of faith that became the basis for the famous Yigdal poem, Yigdal Elokim Chai. That's based on this 14th century Italian poem based on the 13 principles from Perek Chelek. His introduction to Avot is another masterpiece. It's known as the 8 chapters. And actually, since its translation by Shmuel ibn Tzibon, who was the translator of the guide in the 13th century, he translated the introduction to Avot as a separate work, and became known as the 8 chapters. And because it became wildly popular and recopied as a separate work, it sort of assumed a role as a separate treatise unto itself. And this is really where Maimonides develops certain key fundamental concepts important to ethics and free will and the relationship, different forms of the good life, key to his ethical system. We'll talk more about that next time, God willing, a couple of weeks from tonight, I believe. So each one of these introductions is really critical to Maimonides' self-conception, but also most importantly, his notion of Judaism, his big philosophy of Judaism. So his introduction literature is really where all of this takes place. However, what I'd like to suggest to you tonight is that in another introduction of sorts, Maimonides introduces Judaism in a very creative and unique way. And this is not actually, so this is now turning to the Mishnah Torah, right, the code of law, not actually the introduction to that work, to the code, which is it's itself a kind of a more elaborate repeat of, in some ways, of the introduction to the Mishnah, although he takes it in a slightly different direction. But it's more of an introduction to the oral law. But in addition to that introduction, what he did was he constructed his work in such a way that again, there were 14 parts to the Mishnah Torah. That's why it's called the Yad Chazakah sometimes, Yad standing for 14. However, the first part, which is called the Book of Knowledge, Sefer HaMaddah, was actually, it functions, at least I want to argue that it functions like an introduction of sorts to the rest of the code, which is to say, it's more of a conceptual kind of foundation to the practical law that follows. The 13 books after the Book of Knowledge are focused more on practical laws, whereas the Book of Knowledge is much more conceptual. It's much more sort of fundamental and kind of axioms that are at the roots of the Jewish religion. So that's why, in this sense, I mean, years ago, I remember Rabbi David Hartman used to say that that in many respects, the Book of Knowledge serves this function as a kind of an introduction to Maimonides, to an introduction to Judaism, and I really see that very much as the case in this. And if you take a look at the way he describes it, I think you would agree. First of all, in the introduction to the code, he describes this Book of Knowledge as follows. He says in the first book, the Book of Knowledge, I include all the mitzvot, all the commandments that are at the core, or that are the core of the religion of Moshe Rabbeinu, of Moses, our teacher, of blessed memory, which a person must know before anything else. That is to say, before you can live a Jewish life, theoretically, okay? In other words, before you can really go out and practice everything, you have to have certain fundamentals, certain ideas that are really at the core of this religion. Now, I want to just put out there that it's more complicated than that, because Maimonides distinguished here between kind of first in importance as opposed to first in time, right? Clearly, people need to, children and are trained in the laws, the practical laws, well before they have a grasp of the fundamental concepts. But at least in terms of quality, in terms of the kind of first in significance, these ideas precede the practice of Judaism. And the 5 parts of the Book of Knowledge, I think, really bring this home. We have here, so laws of fundamental principles, and that's the very first part. Yesodei Torah are the fundamental principles that begin with the very existence of God. And then we have, after that, character traits that we'll also be focusing on next time, okay, character traits and ethics. And then we have the laws of Torah study, so more the intellectual side, not necessarily something practical, but Torah, but intellectual. And then we have the laws of idolatry. Idolatry, again, being what not to believe, what not to think, false ideas, right, erroneous ideas. And then we have, of course, the laws of repentance, which in which Maimonides discusses not only what we call repentance, but the concepts of free will, and the idea that our sort of what it means to have a kind of an awareness of God at all times, and it describes there also concepts of the world to come. So these are really fundamental ideas and principles of Judaism that serve in this respect as an introduction to the religion as a whole, and to really kind of his philosophy of Judaism. I want to share one more source with you before we maybe we'll take a question or two before we go to the next section. And that is a section from the Guide of the Perplexed, which serves as a very interesting way into thinking about this idea of the Book of Knowledge and the fundamental concepts of the Jewish religion. This is part of a parable, it's called the parable of the palace in the Guide of the Perplexed, his philosophical kind of magnum opus that is where he describes the different types of Jews and their relation to the fundamentals. And he describes the palace as the place, kind of as a parable where God resides, okay? And he says that those who seek to reach and enter the ruler's palace, but who never find it, are the majority of the adherents of the law. Okay, so most of us, right, seek to reach the palace. We want to find God's presence, but we don't even know the way there. Nobody gave us a roadmap. That's most of us. Then he says, those who arrive at the palace and walk around it, but don't find their way in, those are the scholars of the law. The scholars of the law, the rabbis, the sages, who adhere to true opinions only on the basis of traditional authority. This is a very important concept in medieval Arab thought, that is this idea of blind faith. That in Islam, there was a debate about the value of blind faith. Some thought that the scholars ought to understand the law on their own, whereas the faithful in general ought to follow by blind faith. The Jews in general, Jewish thinkers, argue that nobody should ever adhere to the tradition on the basis of tradition alone. And it's a very important concept here that Maimonides is developing, that even the rabbis who know the law, as long as they don't understand the ideas of the Torah on their own terms, but they only rely on previous teachers, they simply kind of follow blindly. And it's only those, he says in the third to last line, who immerse themselves in investigation into the fundamental principles of religion. They are the ones who enter the antechambers. And again, he makes a distinction once you get into the palace, how far you get in based on what you're studying and how you study it. So the entry into God's presence for Maimonides is not based on the practice of the law alone, nor is it simply on acknowledging certain principles by rote. It's by examining and investigating the key ideas and understanding them on their own terms. Okay, so before we go any further, I want to offer an opportunity for people to ask a question or two. If you have thoughts at this point, you're more than welcome to. And maybe you can, if you would like to offer them by chat, you could do that, or else you're welcome to unmute yourself. Joe, yes. You are muted currently.
In the introduction to the Mishnah, Maimonides gives a version of how the oral Torah comes about,
Yes.
which is strikingly different from the version that occurs in Pirkei Avot, that God gave it to Moshe to Joshua, and so on, generation by generation. I imagine that he has to hold on to both of those ideas, both of those metaphors side by side. But the fact that he introduces a completely different metaphor for how the oral Torah comes about and what is the oral Torah is very striking, at least to me.
Okay. I think I know what you're talking about, but you haven't clarified what the new approach was that you had in mind that Maimonides.
Well, the new approach that he presents seems to be that what God gave Moshe was not a list of actions that had to be taken, but rather a set of principles on the basis of which everything else was going to be derived. And
Okay.
that God, the only specific things that God gave Moshe were things like the age of bar mitzvah, which is absolutely 13, which is absolutely arbitrary, and so there's no rationale for it anywhere. There's no way of reasoning it. So therefore, that was that may not have been one of them, but that was the kind of thing which God gave to Moshe. And other than that, it was mostly rules for derivation, so that rabbis in future centuries could derive things from the Torah, not receiving them just from past generations, but on their own.
Okay. So the fact of the matter is that Maimonides actually didn't sort of state a version of tradition that was more minimal than Pirkei Avot, but actually more maximal than Pirkei Avot. He actually developed in the very beginning of the introduction to the Mishnah Torah, he develops this concept that the entirety of Torah, which includes not only the written Torah, but also the oral Torah, and the entirety of the oral Torah was passed on at Sinai and on down. So he's you may be thinking of somebody else that I'm not sure who you're thinking of exactly, but there are versions of that idea elsewhere. But Maimonides is a maximalist. He understood that the Sinaitic revelation was included the oral tradition, not just the written Torah. All right, and so what he does with Pirkei Avot is Pirkei Avot says the Torah was Moshe received the Torah, and Maimonides explains both the written and the oral. So he goes even beyond what Avot suggests at least on the face of it. But maybe you can get back to me afterwards if you'd like, Joe, of what you were thinking of more specifically. Any other thoughts or questions at this point? Okay, all right. So why don't we move on? Do we have anybody in the chat? No, okay, not yet. So we'll move on with our sources. And what I'd like to do is really kind of investigate with you how Maimonides conceived of Judaism as a philosophy in philosophical terms. And this is really, it goes to the core of his entire oeuvre, and not only, again, the work which is considered to be his philosophical work, The Guide of the Perplexed. What I'm going to do here is go through A, his approach to law and philosophy in the Mishnah, B, his incorporation of philosophical concepts in the Mishneh Torah and the code, and then finally C, we'll look at his philosophy in the guide. But we're not just going to look at the guide tonight. I really want to show you how his thought was really incorporated this kind of synthesis of law and philosophy from the very beginning and all the way to the end. And that as Isidore Twersky, the great, the late Rabbi Dr. Isidore Twersky argued, it's really this synthesis of law and philosophy is the Archimedean principle of Maimonides' works. Right? That is the center of his of gravity, as it were, of his entire corpus. So to start with the beginning, okay, there's a very interesting comment that he makes in his commentary on Brachot, the very last Mishnah of the last chapter of Brachot, where he says that, he said, we can read this together. He says, the words of the philosophers, he says, the true masters of philosophy on these matters, and he's referring to general kind of philosophical, theological principles of God's unknowability. He says, are most wondrous and deep, and require many introductions and intellectual training. All right, now remember, the commentary in the Mishnah is written for the average Jew, not the scholar per se, nor for someone who's philosophically trained. That's the broadest base of kind of audiences. And he's talking here about the depth of philosophical investigation. And he says that an enlightened individual, third line, can penetrate these matters and see how they are aligned with God's word. This is a very key line, that the truly enlightened person not only understands these deep philosophical subjects, but understands how they are, in fact, in harmony with God's word, with scripture, that there is a harmony between the two. He says, I will return to speak on similar matters in Tractate Avot, not surprisingly, in which I will show you how some of the teachings of the greatest of the philosophers correspond, he's speaking here of Aristotle, correspond completely with those of the sages. Okay, so now it's not only that philosophy aligns with the Bible, but philosophy aligns with the teachings of the sages. Never mind the fact that the sages had many different opinions on different subjects. But from his perspective, the sages represent the oral tradition. And just like the written tradition is in sync with philosophy, so is the oral tradition. He says, my approach here, excuse me for that typo, my approach here and everywhere in my commentary in the Mishnah is that whenever there is an allusion to ideas of belief, that I offer an explanation. For it is more important to me, he says, to explain the fundamental ideas than anything else I could teach. So it's a very very powerful kind of honest moment on his part, where he acknowledges that he loves to teach the fundamental ideas and concepts and principles of Judaism more than anything else, more than all the laws. Okay, so this gives you a sense of already in the Mishnah, he's saying here that whenever he comes across the fundamentals in his commentary in the Mishnah, he explains, he uses it as an opportunity, as an occasion to go over the fundamental concepts. Okay. B, in the code, how is it that the law and philosophy, right, were interwoven by Maimonides in the code of law? So I've already talked about the fact that the book of knowledge serves as this kind of conceptual introduction, but how else does this work? So first of all, I want to just, before we kind of go into some close readings, I want to share with you a little snippet from a letter that he wrote to his close disciple. As Yosef ben Yehuda ibn Shimon was the disciple for whom he dedicated the Guide of the Perplexed. And he was a close disciple. They were very close for many years before Ibn Shimon moved on to Syria. But he wrote to him, they exchanged a number of letters. And in one place, Maimonides talks about his aim in writing the code of law, the Mishnah Torah. He says, you should know that I did not compose this treatise for self-promotion. Rather, and it's because he's talking about the fact that Ibn Shimon mentions to him that the scholars in Syria are critical of his work. He says, it doesn't bother me. I didn't write it for self-promotion. Rather, he says, I composed it, as God may attest, first of all for myself. I mentioned this before, actually, in earlier classes, in order to facilitate my search for answers as needed and for when I grow old, right? So that I would remember what the law says on X, Y, or Z subject. And also for God's sake, may be exalted. For God knows I became zealous for the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, when I saw a nation devoid of a truly comprehensive book of law and devoid of true and accurate ideas. So here, what Maimonides is suggesting is his sort of his ideological motivation, if you will. In other words, not just the practical motivation, but what really moved him to write this work was, first of all, the fact that there was no comprehensive book of law of the type in the Jewish world, and that's absolutely the case. So we talked about this before. But also the fact that the Jewish people lacked a kind of a clear review of their fundamental ideas, what he calls true and accurate ideas. So he uses the opportunity of writing the kind of totality of the Torah Shebe'al Peh, the oral Torah, to provide both sides of the coin, both the laws and the ideas. And that's really how we conceived of Mishnah Torah. It is both and. And as we saw last time, in addition to just putting the book of knowledge in there, right, as the kind of as part one, he also incorporated these ideas all the way through. Last time I mentioned the way that he kind of incorporates the meaning in the mitzvot, right? That he explains the deeper ideas inherent in various different laws. That's certainly one way that he does this. And we also talked last time about the fact that he rationalized aspects of the tradition that were superstitious, right? He wrote out the demons and the diabolical forces. But I want to explore with you some other ways in which he does this. Number one is the integration of Torah and wisdom. Okay, and I'm going to show you this in a number of different ways. Torah and wisdom. Okay, Torah v'chuchma. Notice what he does. In each of these cases, I provide for you Maimonides' passage, and then the line from the sages from the classical tradition, and the Talmud that it's based on. So let's have a look first at what Maimonides says in his laws of Torah study, Talmud Torah. He says here, the words of the Torah do not exist with one who studies listlessly, weakly, or with one who learns in luxury and self-indulgence, but only with a person who mortifies himself to acquire them. That is to say, kind of sacrifice his own comforts, enduring discomfort at all times, and not permitting sleep to his eyes or slumber to his eyelids. In a separate passage, Maimonides talks about the importance of studying Torah at night, right? So he literally, depriving yourself of comforts and sleep. And he says the sages explained a verse in Numbers. It says, this is the law when a man dies in the tent. And this is all about the laws of purity and and a person that dies in a tent, and what happens to the things and the people in that tent in terms of impurity. But the sages explained it homiletically, or as he says here, metaphorically. He used the word remez. He says the Torah abides only with one who mortifies himself. That's when a man dies in a tent. In the tents of wisdom, a man dies in a tent. It means a person mortifies himself in the tents of wisdom. Okay, that's how you learn Torah. This is the law. This is the Torah. You you kill yourself to learn the Torah. You work so hard, and you stay up late at night to acquire the Torah in the tents of wisdom. He says. And if you look at the passage on which it's based in Brachot 63a, it says very simply, the Torah abides only with one who mortifies himself for it being the Torah. Well, Maimonides, of course, understood Torah and wisdom as really two parts of the same experience, two sides of the same coin. And so he often will basically substitute one for the other, as he does here. And this is one of my favorite exercises when I teach Mishnah Torah to my students at NYU. I have them look at a law, and I have them trace it back to the original Talmudic discussion and see how he very subtly alters it or shapes it in his own image. Let's look at another example. Laws of forbidden relations. Okay, this is where he brings up the laws of conversion. He says the sages of the court, when somebody comes to convert before the Beit Din, the court of Jewish of rabbinic law, they instruct the convert that through among the other things that they tell the convert, that through the fulfillment of the mitzvot, one earns the world to come. That a truly righteous person, Maimonides says, who is one who has acquired wisdom, who performs the mitzvot, and who understands them. Ba'al ha'chokhmah, just use this, the original language. She'oseh mitzvot elu v'yod'an, and understands them or knows them. Now again, take a look at the original passage. The sages of the court instruct the convert regarding the mitzvot, the reward for mitzvot, and say, be aware that the world to come is only for the righteous. So how has Maimonides taken this original source and reshaped it? So the original source has this concept of the world to come being a reward for mitzvot. But it also has this notion that those are the righteous. The righteous ones are the ones who perform mitzvot. Maimonides takes that original concept, but he builds upon it. And it's not only that someone has fulfilled the mitzvot, but how does a person fulfill the mitzvot? How does a person become a truly righteous person? Well, number one ingredient is you have to acquire wisdom. Again, it's not in the original, but for Maimonides, the mitzvot are part of Torah, and Torah and wisdom are synonymous. Okay, wisdom is also more generalized. It's not only Torah. That's the kind of the key movement that he makes from Torah to wisdom. And it's also the fact that it's not only about the activity, the performance of the mitzvot, it's also about understanding the mitzvot. That the mitzvot they correspond to key ideas themselves. Because of course, every mitzvah has an idea lurking within it. Every mitzvah, every action has a reason. It has a motivating principle. It has an idea. So it's not sufficient for us to simply practice the mitzvot, he says. We have to understand them. We have to be people who seek out wisdom. And that's the deeper concept here. For Maimonides, a fulfillment of the mitzvot. Okay. This is example number 2. Example number 3. Laws of the murderer. He said, this is a classic, very interesting discussion based on Makot 10a, where he puts it as follows. If a student was banished to a city of refuge, so again, for an unintentional murder, or unintentional killing, a person goes to the city of refuge in the old biblical law. His teacher, if this happens, his teacher must be exiled with him. As it is written, and he shall live. That is, Maimonides explains, in order for him to live. Not just that he should survive, but that he should really live. How does he live? For the wise And those who seek wisdom, ba'alei chokhmah umvakshea, life without Torah study is like death. Those who seek wisdom and those who live a life of Torah study are one and the same, because that is why we learn Torah, is to grow in wisdom. It's not just about learning the practices. It's about the bigger ideas and the fundamentals. A life of wisdom, right, is what it's all about. And without the ability to cultivate wisdom, without my teacher, exile is like death. Notice again the original source. A student who is exiled, his teacher is exiled with him, right? As it says, he shall live so that he will be able to live. What Maimonides adds, of course, is what makes all the difference. What are you living for? What are you living for? You're living for a life devoted to wisdom. That is what a Torah study really is ultimately for. But it's both those who have wisdom and those who are seekers of wisdom, right? The philosophers, which is, of course, what the word means, seekers of wisdom. All right, these are just 3 examples among many of the way in which he weaves wisdom into his concept of Torah. Okay, now I want to focus on a different way in which Maimonides makes philosophy a part of his construct of Judaism. And that is this idea that philosophy can even be conceived as a religious duty. I want to take you to the very beginning of the Mishnah Torah after the introduction, the beginning of the book of knowledge, the laws of the foundations of the Torah. He begins famously with this statement: the foundation of all foundations and the pillar of all sciences is to know that there is a primary being. Okay, this is his philosophical terminology for God, okay, a first existent who brings all beings into existence. The very beginning of the Code of Law, it talks about the first fundamental principle, that of God, but it's not a belief. Notice there's no word term here for belief. It's knowledge. The foundation of all foundations is to know. It doesn't say to believe that there is a primary being, right? So if I am an ordinary, let's say, Jew in the synagogue, Maimonides community, and I have I believe in God, but I don't understand what that means. I don't have a sophisticated conception of God. I don't understand what it means to say that God, the way that God exists is different from the way that other existence exist. What does it mean to say I believe in God? Is that sufficient for me? Is that enough for me to say, ani ma'amin, I believe? Maimonides says the real principle is to know, not just to believe. And then what he proceeds to do is he provides a kind of a skeleton, let's say, argument for this concept. He says, all that exists, right, only exists from the truth of its being that primary being. In other words, everything that exists contingently upon that primary being. And that primary being is the only being which is truly being. It says that, they only exist from the truth of his being. Truth of his being, in other words, because that is the only existence, the primary being, God, is the only thing that exists truly. Which is to say, philosophically speaking, the only being which is not contingent upon anything else. It is self-sufficient. It is not generated by anything else. It is not caused by anything else. It is not contingent. It is being in the true sense of the word. Okay. Whereas we exist and we have different qualities that come and go over our lives, and eventually we go. God remains. God is being in its true sense. If one were to imagine, he says, that it does not exist, no other being could possibly exist. And it goes on like this. Right? He provides a kind of philosophical introduction of the concept of God and existence, which is kind of, in some ways you might think is overpowering for the individual who's just starting out trying to read a book of the law. But for Maimonides, this is the fundamental principle from which everything else flows. Right? The same way that all existence flows from God's existence, all Judaism flows from these fundamental principles. The question is, right, then as he ends here, he says the knowledge of this principle is a positive commandment. Positive commandment. As it says, I am the Lord your God. Now, people often misstate this commandment of Maimonides as saying that Maimonides says that belief in God is a commandment, positive commandment. Maimonides doesn't say that that belief in God is a positive commandment. He doesn't say anything about belief. It's the knowledge that is a positive commandment. We have an imperative to know, to understand these principles. And if we don't live up to that expectation, we haven't fulfilled that commandment. If we don't know, we don't fulfill the commandment. And so that's why I suggest here that for Maimonides, philosophy, which is how we get to this understanding in the first place, constitutes a kind of religious duty. All Jews are, in a sense, enjoined to study philosophy, even at its most rudimentary, in order to understand these fundamental principles, to have even the most basic conception of God that he expects of us. So it's a knowledge commandment. Second example from the foundations of the Torah. This has to do with love and fear. He says it's a commandment to love and fear this glorious and awesome God. You shall love the Lord your God and fear God your Lord. But then he asks, what is the path to love and fear God? What does he say? When a person contemplates God's wondrous and great deeds and creations and appreciates God's infinite wisdom that surpasses all comparison, he will immediately love, praise, and glorify God. Love, for Maimonides, is not an emotion, not when it comes to God. It's a function of knowledge. As he says later in the book, in the part of the laws of repentance, he says that according to the knowledge, so is the love. The more we know God, the more we love God. It's not an emotion. It's based on our contemplation, our investigation, our study, our intellect. And again, that's for love. And again, he says, when a person reflects on these very matters, again, contemplating them intellectually, he will immediately recoil in awe and fear. Why? Because a person would appreciate how, when I look at the universe and I contemplate God, I remember how tiny, lowly, right, and small I am. And so this kind of puts me into the state of awe. But again, it's not just a feeling. It's rooted in this contemplation of the universe and meditation on God. So what this really means, again, for Maimonides, is in order to fulfill the commandment to love and fear, we have to actually study the universe. We have to study the principles of existence. We have to study philosophy. Philosophy is not just for the elite. Maybe the deeper study of philosophy, but not philosophy in its fundamental form. That's for everybody. All Jews, he says, are expected, are commanded to know, to contemplate, to reflect. Okay? And that's why in the parable of the palace that we saw before, those who study the law, those who practice the law but don't understand the principles, they don't even know where the palace is, where God's palace is. Those who are scholars of the law, they know where the palace is, but they don't know how to get in. Those who really get into the palace, you might say, who really fulfill the expectation of a Jewish life, are those who contemplate, who reflect, who know. And so it's a really radical concept in that sense, this idea of philosophy as an obligation. I'd like to maybe a bit more briefly discuss his approach in the Guide of the Perplexed. Okay, what kind of work is the guide? Who is the guide's intended audience? This is his work that is primarily, right, it's philosophical. It's the work that is intended for the philosopher, right? But how does he put it in the guide? He says that the primary aim of this treatise of the guide is to explain the meaning of certain terms in the Bible that appear to be problematic. Books that seem to describe God anthropomorphically, okay, as having body parts or even emotions. He says it's not the aim of this treatise to make all of it intelligible to everybody who doesn't understand. Rather, he says, because the aim of this treatise and all those like it, and this is that I find very, very interesting, and all those like it, any treatise like this one, is the knowledge of the law in its true sense, the deeper understanding of the fundamental principles of the law. And so who is really the one for whom this law is intended? It is the person who is a religious person, okay, for whom the truth of the law is established in his soul and realized in his thought, but also who has studied the philosophical sciences. It's somebody who is both a master of traditional Judaism and philosophy. And what happens to this person? This person is drawn on by the intellect, but then becomes distressed by the external meanings of the law, by certain ambiguous terms, parables of the prophets that suggest that God has a body, God has a strong arm and a strong hand and a mighty arm, or things of that nature. The throne of glory, right? These ideas that describe God in anthropomorphic terms. People who have studied philosophy, he says, are perplexed by this problem. How could the law be true if it is contrary to philosophical principles? So Maimonides says his primary aim in this treatise is to address those people and to explain, like he suggested, like we saw earlier, how in fact those philosophical principles are in sync, are in harmony with God's law. The two go together, okay? That we don't have to choose one or the other. And those people, he says, who are perplexed, right? This book is for them. This is their guide to help explain what those parables are really saying, so that we don't assume that they are in contradiction to fundamental principles of truth. And here is where he says later on in the introduction, where he admits that I'm not actually writing this book for everybody. He says, if I feel the need to teach a demonstrated truth for one person and it displeases 10,000 others who are ignorant, I prefer to address that single individual alone. And I don't heed the blame of the multitude. My goal here is to address the Jewish philosopher, even if it's only one person, like Ibn Shimon. If it's only one person, that's sufficient for me, he says. Right? Again, contrasts the writings of the commentary in the Mishnah, the Mishnah Torah, which is all about addressing, right, the intellectual and other needs of the entire community. And he did believe that a certain kind of rudimentary knowledge of philosophy was necessary for everybody. And yet, for those who go beyond the antechambers and really want to go into the inner recesses of the palace, this book is for them. Okay, that's the purpose of the guide. Philosophy is everywhere in Maimonides' writings, but in the guide, it has a special place. Okay, what I'd like to suggest to you in the time remaining is that two things. Okay, this pertains to this issue of Jewish and Gentile wisdom. Is how is it that he claims that Judaism and philosophy are in fact in sync if philosophy was never part of the Jewish canon to begin with? So Maimonides challenges us to rethink that idea that the two were actually originally separate traditions that he kind of is trying to connect here. In fact, he argues philosophy was originally part of the Jewish tradition. This is what I'm calling here ancient Jewish philosophy. Maimonides argues, and again, it's not only in the guide. He actually first argues this in his introduction to his commentary in the Mishnah. He says it in the code, and he says it again in the guide. But it just goes to this concept of these two esoteric principles in rabbinic thought: the Maaseh Merkavah, the vision of Ezekiel's chariot, and the Maaseh Breshit, the account of creation. He argued, and I'm not going to read this because it'll take too much time, but based on this Mishnah and Chagigah, suggests that one should not teach those subjects in public, or even to two people, even to one person, depending, right, if each one is a little bit different there. You can see in the Mishnah, account of creation can't be taught to two. Account of charity can't even be taught to one, unless it's a sage who understands on his own or her own. In this case, Maimonides says, what is the meaning of the account of creation? In his commentary, he says, the account of creation refers to the natural sciences. Account of creation is physics, biology, astronomy. And what about the account of the chariot? Ezekiel's vision of the divine glory in the first chapter of Ezekiel. This is the divine science. What in Arabic is known as, what we call into translation, metaphysics, the study of philosophy. So for Maimonides, the subjects of the natural sciences and the divine sciences, that is to say, physics and metaphysics, put simply, is part of the Jewish legacy from antiquity. It was the sages who suggested that they shouldn't be taught, right, to large audiences because they could be misunderstood and misused. But for Maimonides, this was always part of Judaism. And so he's in the guide, again, if you'd like, I'm happy to send you this source sheet. You can read it more carefully on your own. He actually struggles in the first part of, in his introduction to part 3 of the guide, he struggles with how it is that he can teach these things at all, given the fact that we're not supposed to teach these things abroad and publicly. And writing it in a book is the most public of ways that one can imagine, right, to teach something that's supposed to be kept a secret. So he suggests here that, that we're living in a time when there's a great danger of this tradition being lost. And he felt it was an imperative to teach it in a slightly more esoteric fashion in the guide, but to teach it nonetheless so that it wouldn't be lost altogether. That's kind of this idea that this is a really ancient part of Judaism that he's trying to reclaim, and that ultimately, right, we still need to adhere to the rabbinic principle of esotericism, not to teach it publicly, but that we need to acknowledge that that it needs to be taught for fear that it may be lost. Okay. Now, we're at our time, so I just want to end with one last thought, and then I'll be happy to take a few more minutes to answer some last questions if you have them. And this is the Maimonides' fierce adherence to the truth, right? And not only kind of a parochial notion of Jewish tradition, but the truth writ large. And this will serve as a segue to our study in 2 weeks in his ethics. In his preface to the 8 chapters, which is his comments, again, is his introduction to Pirkei Avot, he suggests that he tells his reader that they need to be aware that the ideas that he's presenting are not only from the Jewish tradition. They're gleaned from the words of the sages of Israel, Jewish sages, but also from the words of the philosophers, both ancient and modern. Ancient being the Greek philosophers, and modern being the Arab philosophers. And what does he say to his Jewish readers? You must heed the truth no matter the source, whether it comes from Jewish sources or non-Jewish sources. Of course, for Maimonides, this was all originally part of the Jewish tradition. But now that we're reclaiming it, we need to reclaim it from wherever we can find the truth, even if it comes from Arabic Islamic philosophers or Greek philosophers. And here I want to show you something extraordinary. The last minute, I know I'm taking up, we got started a little bit late, so I forgive me for this, just last thought. Maimonides tells his readers, his Jewish readers, to accept the truth, even if it doesn't come from a Jewish source. And look at where this idea comes from. Al-Kindi, the very first Muslim philosopher, when he was trying to convince his Muslim readers to accept Greek philosophy, what does he say? We ought not to be ashamed of appreciating the truth and acquiring it wherever it comes from. And this became a kind of a rallying cry of medieval Arabic philosophy. So whereas in Muslim philosophy, it was an appeal to the faithful to listen to the voice of truth, even from a non-Muslim source, that is to say from the Greeks Maimonides takes it and says not only the Greeks, but also the Arabs, not only the ancients, but also the moderns. We have an obligation to heed the truth, no matter its source. And we'll see that, of course, he applies this to a study of the ethics in his 8 chapters. We'll see this in 2 weeks' time. So this will still be our segue to that study in our last session. So I'm going to stop sharing, and I appreciate your patience with these last few minutes. If you like, nobody should feel obliged, but given the hour, but you're most welcome to ask some questions, and I would be very happy to address them.
I have a question.
Stephen, yes, go ahead.
Does Maimonides reference any of the wisdom literature, Proverbs, and maybe even Ben Sira? He talks about philosophy and wisdom. So
good question. Yes, indeed, not Ben Sira. The Talmud does cite Ben Sira, but not Maimonides. But he cites the wisdom text primarily in his ethical works and his philosophical works. He cites a lot from Proverbs and Ecclesiastes and Job. Yes, so the classic wisdom works from the Bible. Indeed, a lot from Proverbs. Robert.
Yes, for Maimonides, was a righteous person someone who just acquired wisdom, or someone who both acquired wisdom and applied it in their life and community?
Oh yes, excellent. So indeed, Maimonides, this is one of the classic sort of themes in his philosophy, is this back and forth between theoretical virtue and practical virtue. And he does seem to adhere to a principle that we have from a number of Arabic philosophers, as well as Aristotle, that the height of our philosophical attainment, the height of our human achievement, is actually intellectual, because according to the Aristotelian teleology, that is to say, our kind of ultimate aim as human beings is to cultivate that which makes us unique as human beings, our reason. And so the ultimate attainment is intellectual. However, by the end of the guide, he suggests that the goal of this kind of intellectual attainment is to lead a life that is infused with that wisdom, and to lead a life of moral virtue and justice and love, which flows from that intellectual virtue. So it ends up being a kind of a cyclical. The practice of virtue, of moral virtue, leads a person ultimately to intellectual virtue. You can't be intellectually, all right, you can't have intellectual attainments while being a vicious person. So one leads to the other, but the intellectual attainment in turn has consequences for how you live your life again back in the world. And that's why he uses the image of the ladder of Jacob, right? Jacob's ladder in his vision goes up into heaven and back down again. And he argues that this is really the ascent of the intellect into the heavens, and then again it has to descend into the world of action. Excellent, Kevin. Yes, Rabbi Friedman.
So Yasher Koach, first of all, this was really beautiful on many levels. You may touch on this next week, but is there any, I understand Salanter much later sort of takes on Midot and Musar and Vad. Is there any sort of understanding that Rambam would get together and form a Vad to work on Midot? Is there any writings on this?
Very interesting. Not in the same extent of self-improvement groups in the Musar movement. What's similar though is the focus on character traits, and of the ability to overcome one's darker nature through kind of character training. But Maimonides, as we'll see next time, is more focused on ethical virtues, on cultivating certain kinds of character traits, but they're only we can only cultivate them through action ultimately. But the same kind of, let's say, social experiment that we find in the Musar movement of the 19th century, not the same thing. But it's a very interesting kind of parallel to this idea that one can, through serious inner work, we can actually transform ourselves. That's very much my Maimonidean concept through and through. Excellent. Yes, Fran.
Yes. You said a moment ago, you were talking about the intellectual person, and I didn't quite catch. Was he implying that being an intellectual would lead to a moral person?
Yes. Well, not that you can't become a philosopher, a true philosopher, without also being an ethical person. And according to Maimonides, he actually mocks those philosophers who are surprised that they haven't achieved anything when they haven't improved their moral character. And so he argues that the moral training is a necessary part of the kind of human fulfillment, what he calls the perfection of our natures. But at the same time, the result of that intellectual awareness has to then move back into the world and is realized in a life of justice and love for others. That's the way that the guide ends ultimately. So it surprised many readers over the years because of the emphasis that Maimonides places in the guide on intellectual attainment. And yet, by the time he ends the guide, he's moving back into action. So, but ultimately, if you read Maimonides carefully, there is a cyclical nature here based, again, on this kind of Jacob's ladder phenomenon of moving up and down. The two are definitely they work together. There's no question about it. But it's not that one learns to live a virtuous life through the intellectual attainment. It's that one then, the fruit of that intellectual attainment can then flow out into the world and benefit society.
So that's interesting because in my university time, I experienced a lot of people that were intellectual bullies.
Yeah.
Which is, I mean, his concept is quite different. He wouldn't tolerate that.
That's exactly right. He would. That's exactly the kind of people he was mocking that I mentioned before. That they're surprised they haven't made it to the highest rung of actually attaining prophecy. Which, according to Maimonides, the highest level of intellectual attainment is the highest level of prophecy. But they don't know why they haven't attained it, and he explains that it's because their lives are a mess. Maybe because their egos get in the way. Unfortunately, people who live a life of intellectual attainment, unfortunately, become very full of themselves a lot of the time. It's a problem, and one has to really work on oneself and have the right perspective. In that, as for Maimonides, one really needs to not only master logic and mathematics and astronomy and biology, one also really needs to master ethics, cultivate one's inner virtues. So on that note, this will segue next time, God willing, in 2 weeks, I think, right, to ethics. And I really look forward to our culminating class together. I appreciate your excitement and your devotion to this learning. It's been a great pleasure for me. So I look forward to next time to ethics.
Yeah. So Elisha, thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
I'll stop the recording now, and